Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to see you and welcome all of you to the first Bandung International Conference on Social Science. Before we start, allow me to guide this session in English and Bahasa. Now, we will discuss about contemporary trends in research on Indonesian society and politics. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker today is Professor Vedi Hadiz. He is Director and Professor of Asian Studies at the Asia Institute and an Assistant Deputy Vice Chancellor International at the University of Melbourne. He was also previously an Associate Professor of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. In his current role with the University of Melbourne, he has assisted the university to build stronger relationship with Indonesia, including its universities and government, as outlined in the University of Melbourne, Indonesia. Professor Hadiz research interests revolve around political sociology and political economy issues, especially those related to the contradiction of development in Indonesia and Southeast Asia more broadly and more recently in the Middle East. Professor Hadiz is an elected fellow of the Academy of Social Science in Australia and was an Australian Research Council Featured Fellow in 2010 until 2014. Professor Hadiz's last book is Islamic Populism in Indonesia and the Middle East. Professor Hadiz has been a visiting scholar in the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Science in France, the International Institute of Social Studies in the Netherlands, the Center of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Kyoto, the Department of Humanities and Social Science at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and the Department of Sociology at the University of Indonesia, where he is also an adjunct professor. Before starting the presentation, let me inform how the presentation will be going on. The speaker will deliver his presentation in 40 minutes. Then the discussion time is 20 minutes. Now, allow me to welcome to the speaker, Professor Vedi Hadiz, to deliver his presentation, please. Professor Vedi, please deliver your presentation.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you for inviting me to this esteemed international conference. Can you hear me properly, everybody?
Yes,
yeah,
sure.
Okay, good. Just a few preliminary remarks before I get into the gist of what I wanted to say. First of all, I think that it's very important to develop disciplinary strengths, and it seems like this disciplinary route is what is being mainly undertaken or explored within this international conference. But at the same time, I'm actually a great believer in interdisciplinary research. I think that all of the major problems that are being faced by the world and by Indonesia today needs to be dealt with on the basis of interdisciplinary approaches rather than siloed disciplinary sort of traditions and approaches. So I think it's very important to develop that sense of the ability to deal with themes that are important across disciplines and not to be fixated on particular kinds of traditions and methodologies that we think are sort of sacred to our own disciplines if they mean that they would impede interdisciplinary research. So that's one of my sort of preliminary point here. And a second point I would like to make is, because I probably won't have time to discuss this further, in much of this, of the actual talk, is I'm a great believer also in comparative research. So even if we are doing studies on Indonesia, that Indonesia is our focus, and being Indonesian scholars, that seems to be quite natural. I do believe that we, as scholars of Indonesia, especially now, aspiring to make a mark in the international arena, should be aware of Indonesia in relation to the rest of the world, that the problems of Indonesia are related to the problems of the world, that the problems of the world are related to the problems of Indonesia. And this relates to everything that we could talk about in relation to studies of Indonesian society and politics. So even though I am talking about something quite specific, and that is the study of Indonesian society and politics, I believe that one needs to undertake such studies on the basis of interdisciplinary frameworks, and also with a mind to be able to draw insights from comparisons, whether in the region or even in the broader global community. So those are a couple of things I would like to say. I mean, my own work, to give an example, it was mentioned that I focus on political sociology and political economy. So that brings together politics, sociology, economics, and actually history is also a major element in a great deal of my work. And in terms of comparisons, even though I do work primarily on Indonesia, I have worked on Indonesia in comparison to Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, and more recently in my work on Islamic politics in relation to Turkey and Egypt. So, I mean, I'm not saying that this is the only way to do things, but I would actually encourage more of our scholars, especially younger scholars, to think about interdisciplinary work and also to think about comparative analysis, because this is the kind of work that I think actually deals with key problems and deals with key problems theoretically, and therefore also makes it more possible for our work as Indonesian scholars to appear and to be accepted and to be valued in the international literature. If we do not only come across as being parochially, experts on Indonesia. Okay, those are sort of very long preliminary comments. Now, I hadn't given a title to my talk, but if I were to give a title, it would be something that might surprise you, and the title would be The Return of Modernization Theory. It might sound very odd that in the year 2021, somebody would be talking about modernization theory, which I think everybody in my generation of scholars in Indonesia studied in their various universities. Me in the University of Indonesia, we all studied Eastern, Verba, structural functionalism, Parsons and whatnot. And it seems like 50 years later, 40 years later, why would I be talking about modernization theory again? Well, I'll explain that, and hopefully it will make sense to you. First point I'd like to make is that research on Indonesian society and politics have always been, you might say, dictated by the vicissitudes of academic fashion internationally. And also, though, not just by academic trends or fashion, but by geopolitical and international political economy circumstances that influence the shaping of intellectual and academic agendas globally, including in Indonesia. So I would say that the template really for the study of Indonesian society and politics was established in the 1950s and 1960s. And as you know, that was the period of the Cold War. That was the period of global decolonialization and of new state building projects across the former colonialized world. Yeah, I hope it is, in the context of competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, in that context, what became the determining element really in that template of the study of Indonesian society and politics was modernization theory, as it was primarily developed and shaped within primarily North American academia of the 1950s and the 1960s. And North American academia of the 1950s, 1960s also came up with area studies. And area studies is where Indonesian studies actually emerge in places like the Netherlands, and then the United States, and places like Cornell, and then later on in Australia in places like Monash, the ANU, and also Melbourne University. A kind of division developed there, whereby a lot of the theory was undertaken in the disciplines, whilst area studies became very, very descriptive and very focused on collecting of data. And there was a reason for that. During that time, it was important for the United States and its allies to have a good understanding of the societies that were decolonizing, including Indonesia, in the context of the competition with global communism. So a lot of the deep analysis that was undertaken on Indonesian society by people like Clifford Geertz and so on, had to do with these sorts of imperatives, although, of course, Geertz also contributed greatly to theoretical frameworks in anthropology, hermeneutics, etc. But the real sort of agenda, if you might use the word agenda, was that the social science, academia, knowledge was being shaped, whether in the metropolitan countries, advanced industrial countries, or Indonesia, as a means of safeguarding the West and its allies in the third world, including Indonesia, against the threat of the communist nemesis. And this had all sorts of implications, I think. Now, before I go there, before I go to the implications, let me say that that period of dominance of modernization theory in the study of Indonesia and other developing societies did not go completely unchallenged, and this had to do with social contradictions and rise of new forms of social dissent in the West in the 1960s, and by the 1970s and 1980s, especially influenced by Latin American development sociology, there emerged a critique of modernization theory, which really developed in the 60s and 70s, but only came to be of any influence in Indonesia in the 1980s. And this was partly as a critique of the New Order regime's modernization model. And I can point to old, much more senior colleagues of mine from the 1980s who were involved in these debates, people like Arif Budiman, Farhan Bulkin, Dawam Raharjo, Mohtar Masud and Sri Tuarif, or various people, outside of Indonesia, people like Richard Robison, later on Jeffrey Winters, Ole Tornquist. These are people who developed or launched critiques of modernization theory because of the charge that it was biased towards stability. It was the structural functionalism and so on behind it, systems theory behind it, was biased towards equilibrium. It was biased towards maintenance of the status quo, and therefore harmonious social relations, and tended to look at social conflict as anathema, in fact, as threat, and therefore approaches that look at social conflict or try to explain social conflict, social grievances, and so on, tended to be overlooked, especially in the official social science that was being developed by the New Order very, very systematically in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, what the critiques of modernization theory, or the critics of modernization theory came up with, was that in its sort of fixation with stability and social harmony, the practitioners of modernization theory in Indonesia in particular overlook issues of growing social inequality, issues of structured power relations that developed systems that would continue to systematically, marginalize and exclude some sections of society while privileging others. So issues of social justice, social inequality, and so on was considered to be largely overlooked by the practitioners of modernization theory, by its critics in Indonesia in the 1980s and part of the 1990s. Now, after 1998, when reformasi occurred in Indonesia, things changed somewhat. Excuse me while I grab a glass of water here. I'm getting old. So, what was I saying? So it happened in 1998. One must remember that occurred nearly a decade after the end of the Cold War. So a lot of the imperatives of the Cold War had changed. There was no communism to fight anymore, and therefore, the sort of dominant theoretical perspectives that came out in the West, especially in still dominant North American educational institutions, did a kind of reworking of modernization theory. And that modernization theory would emphasize things like social capital. So Robert Putnam was a great contributor to that. But of course, social capital was about also binding people together on the basis of values, right? And then there, of course, civil society even entered the lexicon of the World Bank, whereas in the 80s and 90s, it was part of the lexicon of critics of the modernization approach. But in this understanding of social capital, the non-Bourdieuian, by the way, understanding of social capital, but the Putnamian one, and also of civil society, not the Gramscian one, but the Tocquevillian one, is one that also basically was about developing the sorts of values and attitudes that would be amenable to the development of market capitalism and what was assumed at the time to be its natural partner, a liberal democracy. So here we see a change already, because by the late 1960s, actually, classical modernization theory had almost abandoned the pluralist liberal elements that had underpinned it in the 1950s. But this is seen particularly in the work of Samuel Huntington after 1968, which was adopted by Indonesian officials in the 1970s, even though often unattributed, especially in the works of Ali Murtopo, in which really the signature of modernity in the 1970s and 80s was not the attainment of cultural transformation that would bring about liberal, pluralist cultural values and attitudes, but the signature of modernity would be social stability. And if this meant authoritarian rule, if this meant social engineering by the state through all the apparatus that is at its disposal, then that was fine. And we saw this marriage of authoritarianism and modernization theory, I think, at the height of the New Order in the 1980s. So in a way, the focus on cultural transformation which basically means transforming tradition to modernity, helped to gloss over these issues of social inequality, injustice, and so on that I mentioned earlier, because the problem there would be just people's attitudes. It's people's patrimonialism, people's feudal sort of thinking, and so on. And what would be the solution to that problem? Well, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, up to the 90s, and up to now, really, the strategy was education. And it was the education of elites and the middle class that was hoped to then become the vanguard of that cultural transformation from, sort of traditionality to modernity. And modernity, of course, is understood as the sorts of values that would be supportive of market capitalism. After the Cold War, the focus on cultural transformation and values and so on continued, but there was a re-emphasis on its liberal elements, whereas in the 70s and so on, as long as their social values didn't result in the disruption of the social order, that was fine. And we could see that from the fact that the middle class that was produced by the New Order was far from liberal, pluralist, and democratic. A lot of them became very conservative, very, very, tied to the social order that was the New Order. And it was only with the crisis of 97, 98, when their own economic and material base was threatened, that they developed progressive tendencies. So in 98, with the fall of Suharto and democratization in Indonesia, the influx of all sorts of aid organizations in Indonesia, I was involved in talking to them in 98, the IDI, IRI, all kinds of democracy promotion institutions from the West. I mean, the idea was to develop, democracy education in Indonesia, especially amongst its young people, its middle class, and so on, students. It was things like writing the right political party laws that would then incentivize liberal, pluralist, democratic kinds of attitudes and so on. I mean, the irony of that is that part of this took place, in the early 2000s, when America was under the neocons, and when the promotion of democracy was undertaken by America through violence. So even from the source of these ideas, we see a contradiction from in the practices of democracy promotion and the reputed fundamental ideas. Now, so in Indonesia too, we saw throughout the 2000s up to now, I think a strong focus on research on civil society, on social capital, on issues having to do with developing democratic civility, as some people call it. But then again, new problems emerged, and this can be seen in the global economic crisis of 2008 and 2009, which gave rise to questions about the way that the international political economy was actually structured, and whether it was sustainable. And also more lately, with the emergence of global populism, including in America, supposedly the home of democracy. Also in some sections of Australian politics, European politics, the UK, and in various parts of the world. And you see some of that in Indonesia as well. But what this has meant was actually, a crisis in faith, in the tenets of the sort of international global neoliberal political economy, and in the tenets of traditional liberal politics, even in its heartlands in the West. What that has resulted in is a new critique of these sorts of ideas about cultural civilities, forms of analyses that also are much more related to the maintenance of social cohesion, tends to overlook social conflict and social injustice and so on. And therefore we see in the West the emergence of new kinds of criticism, new forms of development of post-colonial and decolonial theory, new forms of Marxian sociology, new forms of critical theory, new forms of critical discourse analysis, and so on. But I would suggest that none of these have actually made much of an impact on the study of Indonesian society and politics, that we're still going on the basis of the sort of post-Cold War and post-1998 sort of trends where the fixation remains on the transformation, really, again, and this is why I say the return of modernization theory, because the fixation remains on the cultural transformation of from traditionality to modernity. And again, traditionality is defined as sort of pre-modern sorts of ideas, anti-liberal sorts of ideas, but more and more, if it used to be more related to sort of Javanese sort of feudalism, it's now more directed towards conservative forms of Islamic thinking, which is then identified as the main cultural source of impediment to development of liberal pluralist modernity. But my point is that if in the 50s and 60s you had this binary between traditionality and modernity on the basis of Javanese feudalism, let's say, and sort of Western pro market liberal pluralism, right, which was sort of disseminated across our middle classes and elites in the year 2020, 2021. The binary is there, but it is still there. And in a way, it's still one of traditionality versus modernity, although it isn't cast in that way. It's cast as a conflict between conservative Islamism and liberal pluralism, which can include some variations of Islamic thinking. But again, what I'm saying is that the fixation on this cultural transformation aspects of social change makes us overlook issues of social injustice, social roots of social conflict and social grievances, and so on. Now, the fact of the matter is that since the late 1980s up to now, with a slight, sort of push reverse over the last year or two only, and maybe it's gone up again since COVID, Indonesia has become an increasingly unequal society. So even the World Bank says that 1% of Indonesians control 50% of the wealth in this country, which is American levels of inequality, very un-Pancasila.
I'm sorry, Professor. There is only 5 minutes again.
I'll be done by that time. Don't worry. I've forgotten what I was saying now. What was I saying? What was I saying?
Un-Pancasila.
Oh, un-Pancasila. Oh, yeah. All right. That social inequalities and so on are actually un-Pancasila. But the fact of the matter is, even if you use the Gini ratio, which is very flawed, the Gini ratio in Indonesia is close to 0.4, and in the late 1980s, I think it was 0.33 or something like that. So it's always gone up, and therefore what I'm saying is that democracy has not pushed back, that tendency towards greater inequality that was started in the late authoritarian period, right? But our fixation with the things I mentioned earlier makes us forget about these things, and now we're facing it right in front of our noses, and we don't know what to do with it because the stark inequalities in Indonesian society is being presented to us by the COVID crisis, which is incredibly terrible and shows the vulnerability of large sections of Indonesian society. Like in other parts of the world, it is the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalized that have suffered the most from this COVID pandemic. Yet, as social scientists, we are very ill-equipped to understand this, to address this, to deal with this, because we hadn't been paying much attention until this thing, blew up in our face in the last year. And I also say the return of modernization theory, because if I look at especially some developments occurring in major universities in the quote-unquote West, where there are younger people doing studies of Indonesia, there is this also push to sort of adopt methodological orthodoxies related to the disciplines of political science, sociology, and others. And this has meant the return of positivism. So positivism was something that was really a big part of Indonesian social science methodology in the New Order, because it allowed us to be completely embroiled in the technique of social science rather than in the theory of social science and in tackling or addressing fundamental issues. So now, for example, I see all sorts of survey data and so on. I'm not saying that these are not useful, but I'm worried about our fixation on them. Survey data, which basically purport to say that, well, what percentage of Indonesians are still traditional, what percentage of Indonesians are modern and moving in that direction. And for me, that's going back to 1950s, 1960s modernization theory, and it's potentially not very useful in facing today's problems. That's it. Thank you very much.